My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment. Not because you are being threatened. Not because something terrible is coming. But because, in this fictional story of heaven speaking into the silence of a human heart, there is a truth about you that even the person closest to your heart never fully understood. And tonight, that truth begins to surface. Something is waiting for you in this moment. Something connected to the sacrifices you made when nobody was watching. Something connected to the nights when you swallowed your questions instead of asking them. Something connected to the moments when you wanted to walk away from a connection that seemed to demand more from you than it ever gave back. And according to this story, your soulmate has just discovered something they never knew. They found out what you sacrificed in silence. And they are shocked. Not because you sacrificed money. Not because you gave up some obvious opportunity. The sacrifice was deeper. You sacrificed parts of yourself. You sacrificed your pride. Your certainty. Your right to be angry. Your desire to explain yourself. Your need to be understood. And perhaps most painfully of all, you sacrificed the satisfaction of making them feel the pain they once made you feel. You could have exposed everything. You could have told people what really happened. You could have shown them the messages. You could have revealed the conversations. You could have explained every misunderstanding. You could have said, "Look at what I endured." But you didn't. You remained quiet. And somewhere inside that silence, this fictional heavenly narration begins to reveal something your soulmate never expected to learn. They thought you moved on because you didn't care. They thought your silence meant indifference. They thought your distance meant rejection. They thought you had become cold. But what they are beginning to understand now is something completely different. You were trying not to destroy something you still loved. Pause here for a moment. Because this is where the story changes. There was a version of you that wanted answers immediately. There was a version of you that wanted to send one final message. One final paragraph. One final explanation. One final attempt to make them understand exactly how deeply their actions had affected you. You may have typed those words. You may have stared at the screen. You may have rewritten the same message again and again. And then you deleted it. Nobody applauded you for that. Nobody saw the restraint. Nobody knew how difficult it was to choose silence when your heart was screaming for an explanation. But in this fictional message, heaven sees the unseen. And now your soulmate is beginning to see it too. Something happened recently. Maybe they came across an old conversation. Maybe someone mentioned something they had never heard before. Maybe they revisited a memory they had misunderstood. Maybe they discovered that a decision you made years, months, or even weeks ago wasn't what they thought it was. Maybe they learned that when you disappeared, you weren't running away from them. You were protecting them from the storm inside you. And when they discovered that truth, something inside them shifted. Because suddenly, memories they had buried began returning. The day you stopped arguing. The night you didn't respond. The moment you looked at them differently. The conversation where you said, "It's okay," even though it wasn't. The time you walked away without demanding an explanation. The moment you congratulated them while secretly breaking inside. The opportunity you declined. The plan you postponed. The person you refused to replace them with. The words you never spoke. The apology you never demanded. The truth you carried alone. One by one, those memories are returning in this story. And your soulmate is looking at them differently now. They are realizing that perhaps the quiet person they thought had forgotten them was actually the person who remembered everything. This is why you need to hear the next part carefully. Because the greatest sacrifice you made may not have been something you gave up. It may have been something you refused to become. You refused to become bitter. You refused to become cruel. You refused to turn your pain into revenge. You refuse to make another person pay for wounds they didn't create. You refuse to become the version of yourself that pain was trying to manufacture. And that decision cost you more than anyone knew. There were moments when becoming cold would have been easier. There were moments when pretending not to care would have protected your ego. There were moments when you could have said things designed to hurt. You knew exactly where their weaknesses were. You knew what words would make them regret everything. You knew what memories would make them cry. But you didn't use that knowledge as a weapon. And perhaps that is what shocked them most. Because people often understand anger more easily than restraint. They understand revenge more easily than forgiveness. They understand shouting more easily than silence. But you carried something complicated. You loved them. You were hurt by them. You missed them. You were disappointed in them. And somehow, you still wished they would become better. That contradiction exhausted you. There were nights when your heart had two voices. One voice said, "Let them go." Another whispered, "Maybe they are still learning." One voice said, "They don't deserve another chance." Another asked, "What if they were afraid?" One voice said, "Forget them." Another quietly answered, "I can't." And between those voices, you lived. Nobody saw that battle. They only saw the outside of you. They saw your silence. They saw your distance. They saw you continuing with life. They assumed you were fine. But you knew the truth. You were rebuilding yourself while carrying a connection that had never received a proper ending. And now, in this fictional story, your soulmate has begun to understand something frighteningly simple. You weren't asking them for perfection. You were asking them for honesty. You weren't asking them to save you. You were asking them to stop making you feel alone inside something that was supposed to belong to two people. You weren't asking for endless attention. You were asking for consistency. You weren't demanding a fantasy. You were hoping for something real. And perhaps the most painful realization is this. You would have stayed if they had simply told you the truth. Think about that. Maybe you didn't need grand gestures. Maybe you didn't need promises. Maybe you didn't need them to move mountains. Maybe you only needed them to say what was actually in their heart. But they couldn't. Fear got there first. Pride got there first. Confusion got there first. Timing got there first. Other people's opinions got there first. And while they were fighting battles you couldn't see, you were silently sacrificing pieces of your own peace. You waited. You hoped. You prayed in your own way. You tried to understand. And eventually, you learned something painful. Sometimes loving someone doesn't mean chasing them. Sometimes loving someone means releasing them without destroying their name on the way out. And that's what you did. You walked away without telling the whole story. But now the story is coming back. And this time, someone else is reading the pages. Your soulmate. They are discovering details. Little details. Things you never thought would matter. Things you never expected anyone to notice. The fact that you remembered a date they had forgotten. The fact that you defended them when they weren't there. The fact that you never repeated something private they told you. The fact that you protected their reputation even after they hurt you. The fact that when someone misunderstood them, you corrected the story. The fact that you didn't replace them just to prove you could. The fact that you didn't deliberately make them jealous. The fact that you didn't use another person as a bandage. The fact that you didn't turn your relationship into public entertainment. The fact that you kept certain memories private because they still meant something to you. And suddenly, they are asking themselves a question. Why? Why would someone who was hurt so badly still protect me? Why would someone who felt abandoned still refuse to humiliate me? Why would someone who could have exposed me choose silence? Why would someone who supposedly didn't care make so many sacrifices? And this question is becoming impossible for them to ignore. They may have told themselves a story about you. Perhaps they convinced themselves that you were too emotional. Perhaps they thought you expected too much. Perhaps they believed you would always be there. Perhaps they thought you would eventually come back. Perhaps they assumed your love was guaranteed. But then something happened. They discovered that your love had a cost. And you were paying that cost quietly. Not with money. Not with possessions. But with time. With emotional energy. With patience. With opportunities. With sleep. With peace. With the ability to trust. And now they are looking backward. Not because the past suddenly changed. But because they finally have information they didn't have before. And information can change the meaning of a memory. A moment that once looked ordinary suddenly becomes heartbreaking. A goodbye that seemed casual suddenly becomes significant. A delayed reply suddenly makes sense. A strange change in your behavior suddenly has a reason. A decision they thought was selfish suddenly looks like sacrifice. And perhaps the most painful discovery is that some of the things they blamed you for were things you did because you were trying to protect the connection. You didn't tell them everything because you were afraid that telling them would end everything. You didn't demand answers because you were afraid that demanding them would turn love into a courtroom. You didn't expose the truth because you wanted one final chance for things to heal naturally. And when healing didn't come, you chose yourself quietly. That choice wasn't easy. Don't let anyone tell you it was. There is a special kind of pain that comes from leaving someone while still loving them. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like carrying a suitcase filled with memories while pretending your hands are empty. You smile. You continue. You work. You talk. You laugh. You post. You live. But somewhere beneath all of that, a question remains. Did they ever understand what I gave up? In this fictional story, the answer begins to arrive. Yes. They are beginning to understand. But not all at once. It comes in fragments. A conversation. A memory. A photograph. A message. A name. A place. A song. A date. A sentence someone casually says. And suddenly, they are standing in the middle of their own past. And the person they thought they knew looks different. They are realizing that your silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of words you never said. Full of tears nobody saw. Full of decisions nobody knew about. Full of restraint. Full of love. Full of grief. And perhaps full of one final hope. The hope that one day they would understand without you having to beg them to understand. But now comes the part that may surprise you. Your soulmate isn't only shocked by what you sacrificed. They are shocked by what you refuse to sacrifice. You refuse to sacrifice your dignity. You refuse to abandon your values. You refuse to become someone you couldn't respect. You refuse to destroy yourself just to keep a connection alive. And that distinction matters. Because love is not supposed to require you to disappear. In this story, heaven isn't asking you to return to pain. It isn't telling you to chase someone. It isn't promising that another person will magically change. Instead, the spiritual lesson underneath the story is much deeper. The sacrifice was never meant to prove that you deserved love. It revealed how deeply you were capable of loving. And now your soulmate is being forced to confront their own capacity. Because when someone discovers how much another person gave silently, they cannot help but ask, "What did I give?" That question hurts. Especially when the answer is uncomfortable. Maybe they realize they gave mixed signals. Maybe they realize they delayed important conversations. Maybe they realize they listened to other people's opinions instead of listening to their heart. Maybe they realize they protected their ego more than they protected the relationship. Maybe they realize that every time you reached for clarity, they responded with uncertainty. Maybe they realize that every time you needed reassurance, they gave you distance. And perhaps they are beginning to understand why you eventually stopped asking. You weren't giving up because you stopped caring. You stopped asking because you were tired of receiving silence as an answer. There is a difference. And that difference is now echoing inside them. Imagine them sitting alone somewhere. No crowd. No distractions. No performance. Just them and their thoughts. They open an old conversation. They scroll. They stop. They read one sentence again. Then another. And suddenly, they notice something they never noticed before. You were always trying to understand them. But they were rarely trying to understand you. That realization lands heavily. Because suddenly, the person they thought was demanding too much appears to have been asking for very little. And the person they thought was difficult appears to have been carrying enormous patience. The person they thought had moved on appears to have spent months learning how to survive without answers. And the person they thought would always wait finally stopped waiting. That is the moment the story becomes emotionally dangerous, not dangerous in the sense of physical fear, but dangerous to the illusions people build around themselves. Because illusions cannot survive forever. Eventually, truth walks into the room. And when it does, it doesn't knock. It simply stands there. Your soulmate is beginning to meet that truth. And perhaps they don't like what it is showing them. Because the truth isn't saying you were perfect. No. You made mistakes too. You had moments when you reacted emotionally. You misunderstood things. You became impatient. You withdrew. You may have said words you wish you could take back. You may have protected yourself too aggressively. You may have expected them to read your mind. This isn't a story where one person is flawless and the other is guilty. It's a story about two imperfect people who may have loved each other while being unable to love each other correctly. And that distinction changes everything. Because sometimes two people can have genuine feelings and still hurt one another. Sometimes fear disguises itself as distance. Sometimes pride disguises itself as strength. Sometimes silence disguises itself as peace. Sometimes walking away disguises itself as indifference. And sometimes the person who looks like they care the least is the person fighting the hardest to keep from falling apart. Your soulmate may now be realizing that. And there is something else they are beginning to understand. You didn't only sacrifice for the relationship. You sacrificed for the possibility of a better version of the relationship. You were holding space for a future that didn't exist yet. You were thinking. Maybe one day they'll understand. Maybe one day they'll communicate differently. Maybe one day we'll both be ready. Maybe one day the timing will stop fighting us. Maybe one day we won't have to hurt each other to feel safe. Those maybe thoughts kept you alive for a long time. But they also kept you waiting. And eventually, you had to learn that hope without boundaries can become exhaustion. So you changed. Quietly. You didn't announce it. You didn't make a dramatic speech. You simply began putting pieces of yourself back where they belonged. Your time. Your attention. Your confidence. Your dreams. Your identity. Your peace. You began remembering who you were before the connection consumed so much of your emotional world. And that's when something unexpected happened. The less you chased understanding, the more understanding began moving toward you. The less you tried to prove your worth, the more obvious your worth became. The less you explained, the more people began noticing the truth for themselves. And now your soulmate is among those people. But there is a reason this realization feels so shocking to them. Because they may have believed that if you truly loved them, you would never leave. They confused love with unlimited access. They confused patience with permanence. They confused forgiveness with permission. They confused your softness with weakness. And now they are discovering the difference. You can love someone deeply and still choose not to be hurt by them again. You can forgive someone and still require changed behavior. You can miss someone and still refuse to chase them. You can wish someone happiness and still know they are not currently capable of giving you the relationship you need. That is not hatred. That is maturity. And perhaps that is the lesson this fictional message wants to leave in your heart. Your sacrifices were not proof that you should tolerate everything. They were proof that you cared. But caring doesn't mean abandoning yourself. And now, your soulmate may be sitting with that realization. They may be wondering whether they missed their chance. They may be wondering whether your heart is still open. They may be wondering whether the person who once waited for them still exists. And here is where the mystery deepens. Because they are not only thinking about what you sacrificed. They are remembering one particular moment. One moment that seemed insignificant at the time. One moment they didn't understand. One moment they now believe may have contained the entire truth. They remember what you said. Or perhaps what you didn't say. They remember your face. Your silence. Your expression. The way you looked away. The way you seemed to be holding something back. And now they are asking themselves. What if that was the moment they decided to let me go? That thought is haunting them, not with fear, but with regret. Because they realize they may have misunderstood your final act of love. They thought you were leaving because you didn't care. But perhaps you were leaving because you cared enough to stop forcing something that wasn't ready. And that realization changes the emotional meaning of everything that came before it. Suddenly, your last conversation doesn't look like an argument. It looks like surrender. Your distance doesn't look like punishment. It looks like self-protection. Your silence doesn't look like rejection. It looks like exhaustion. Your decision to move forward doesn't look like betrayal. It looks like survival. And somewhere deep inside them, a sentence begins forming. A sentence they may never have had the courage to say before. I didn't know. I didn't know you were carrying that. I didn't know you gave up that opportunity. I didn't know you protected my name. I didn't know you were hurting while telling me you were okay. I didn't know how many times you almost reached out and stopped yourself. I didn't know how many times you chose peace instead of revenge. I didn't know how much you were sacrificing just to keep a small possibility alive. And now that they know, they cannot unknow it. That is the turning point. Because knowledge creates responsibility. Once someone learns the truth, they have to decide what they will do with it. Will they ignore it? Will they bury it? Will they pretend nothing happened? Or will they finally face the person they were too afraid to understand? And according to the emotional arc of this fictional story, your soulmate is approaching that decision. But there is a complication. They don't know whether you would even listen anymore. They don't know whether your heart still recognizes them. They don't know whether the door they once left open has finally closed. And that uncertainty is becoming their greatest struggle. Because they can no longer rely on the old version of you. The version who always reached out. The version who always forgave quickly. The version who always explained. The version who always waited. That person has changed. Not because love disappeared. Because pain taught you boundaries. And this is why the next revelation matters. Your soulmate is not simply shocked by your sacrifice. They are shocked by the person those sacrifices created. You are no longer standing where they left you. You have grown. You have learned. You have become quieter in some ways and stronger in others. You don't need to prove your feelings anymore. You don't need to convince anyone that your love was real. You know what you gave. And more importantly, you know what it cost you. That knowledge has changed your energy. You don't walk into relationships the same way anymore. You don't hand your heart over simply because someone says the right words. You listen for consistency. You watch actions. You notice effort. You protect your peace. And your soulmate can sense the difference. Even from a distance. Even without a conversation. Even without knowing exactly what changed. They feel that the person they once knew is no longer waiting for permission to live. And that realization may be what finally forces them to look inward. Because now they have a question of their own. If I had known then what I know now, would I have treated them differently? They already know the answer. Yes. And that answer hurts. Because the past cannot be edited. You cannot go backward and protect someone from the pain you already caused. You cannot return to the night you chose silence and suddenly speak. You cannot return to the conversation where you misunderstood their intentions. You cannot return to the moment when they needed reassurance and you gave distance. Time doesn't work that way. But sometimes understanding arrives late. Painfully late. And sometimes late understanding is the beginning of transformation. Not necessarily reconciliation. Not necessarily reunion. Transformation. And that distinction is important. Because this story isn't telling you to sit beside your phone waiting for a message. It isn't telling you that someone is guaranteed to return. It isn't asking you to put your life on hold. It is showing you something deeper. Your unseen sacrifices mattered even when the person you made them for didn't understand them. Your tears did not become meaningless simply because nobody witnessed them. Your restraint was not wasted simply because nobody praised it. Your growth was not wasted simply because someone else was late to recognize it. You became someone stronger through the very experience that once made you feel weak. And perhaps that is the most beautiful twist of all. You thought the sacrifice was about keeping them. But maybe the sacrifice was teaching you how to keep yourself. Let that thought settle. Because the story isn't finished. Not even close. There is still one secret your soulmate hasn't fully understood. They have discovered what you sacrificed. They have started connecting the memories. They have begun questioning their own choices. But there is one piece of information they are still missing. One decision you made in silence. One thing you gave up that they never knew existed. One opportunity that could have changed your life. One moment when another path opened in front of you. And you chose differently. They don't know about that yet. And when they finally learn what that choice was, they may understand for the first time just how serious your feelings once were. Because this wasn't merely about waiting for someone. It wasn't merely about hoping. It wasn't merely about missing them. There was a moment when you could have chosen an entirely different future. A future where you never had to wonder about them again. A future where you could have walked into something new without carrying the weight of an unfinished connection. And you almost chose it. You were standing there. The door was open. The opportunity was real. Someone, or something, was offering you a path forward. And you hesitated. Not because you were weak. Not because you couldn't move on. But because one part of your heart still believed the story wasn't finished. Then something happened. Something so small that nobody else would have noticed. A message. A memory. A coincidence. A name. A familiar song. A photograph. Something made you pause. And you made a decision. A decision your soulmate has only now begun to discover. And when they understand why you made that decision, They will finally realize the sacrifice was far greater than they ever imagined. Because the thing you gave up wasn't simply an opportunity. It was a future. A future you could have chosen. A future that might have been easier. A future that might have hurt less. A future where you wouldn't have had to spend so much time wondering whether someone would ever understand your heart. But you walked away from it. And you did it silently. You told almost nobody. You carried the decision alone. And your soulmate never knew. Until now. Now the pieces are moving. The old conversations. The forgotten details. The person who finally told them something. The memory they suddenly remembered. The realization that arrived far too late. Everything is leading toward one revelation. And this is where part 1 must pause. Because in the next moment of this fictional heavenly story, your soulmate is going to discover exactly what you turned down. Who was involved? Why you made that choice? And the one sentence you said to yourself immediately afterward that reveals just how deeply this connection affected you. They thought you sacrificed your comfort. They thought you sacrificed your time. They thought you sacrificed your pride. They had no idea you sacrificed something much bigger. And when they finally learn what it was, they will have to face a question they have been avoiding for a very long time. What if the person I thought was waiting for me was actually the person who had already sacrificed a completely different future just because some part of their heart still believed in us? The answer is waiting behind the next revelation. And the moment they hear the full story, nothing about your silence will look the same again. And now the truth begins to unfold. Not all at once. Not like thunder. Not like some dramatic announcement that forces everyone to pay attention. It comes quietly. Almost painfully quietly. Because some truths are too heavy to arrive loudly. They enter the heart like a whisper. And once they enter, they refuse to leave. Your soulmate is standing at the edge of that truth now. They have already discovered pieces of the story. But they still don't know the whole thing. They know you sacrificed. They know you waited. They know there were opportunities you didn't take. But they don't yet understand why. And somewhere inside them, one question keeps returning. Why would they do that for me? They ask it again. And again. And every time the question returns, another memory follows it. They remember your patience. They remember your eyes. They remember the conversations where you seemed to know something they weren't ready to say. They remember how you sometimes became quiet when they expected you to fight. They remember the moments when you could have walked away angrily. But instead you simply said, "It's okay." Now those two words sound different. Because perhaps it was never okay. Perhaps "it's okay" was the sentence you used when you didn't know how to explain that your heart was becoming tired. Perhaps you were protecting them from the full weight of your disappointment. Perhaps you were protecting yourself from hearing an answer you weren't ready to accept. And now your soulmate understands something they didn't understand before. Your silence had meaning. Every silence had a story. Every distance had a reason. Every time you stepped back, something inside you was being surrendered. And then they discovered the first part of the sacrifice. You had an opportunity to completely detach. An opportunity to choose a different life. An opportunity to stop wondering. Someone entered your world who could have made things easier. Someone who offered attention without confusion. Someone who communicated clearly. Someone who didn't make you question whether you mattered. Someone who looked at you and saw the value your soulmate had overlooked. And for a moment, you considered it. You weren't made of stone. You were tired. You wanted peace. You wanted to experience what it felt like to be chosen without hesitation. You wanted someone who didn't make you decode every silence. You wanted someone who didn't leave you wondering whether tomorrow would bring closeness or distance. And this other possibility stood in front of you. It was real. It was available. It was simpler. But there was one problem. Your heart wasn't free. You could have accepted the easier path. You could have said yes. You could have allowed yourself to be loved by someone who was ready. And maybe nobody would have blamed you. After everything you had endured, people might even have told you that you deserved it. They might have said, "Forget the past. Move forward. Give someone else a chance. Stop waiting." And perhaps they were right. But there was something inside you that couldn't pretend. You couldn't use another person's heart to escape your own unfinished feelings. So you stepped back. You didn't make a dramatic announcement. You didn't tell your soulmate. You didn't post about it. You didn't tell everyone how difficult the decision was. You simply said no. And that one word cost you more than anyone realized. Because you weren't saying no to another person. You were saying no to an easier version of your life. You were choosing uncertainty over convenience. Not because uncertainty was better. But because you knew your heart wasn't ready to make a promise it couldn't keep. And now your soulmate is discovering this. Imagine what that does to someone who believed you had simply moved on. Imagine realizing that the person you thought was replacing you was actually protecting someone else's heart because they still carried feelings for you. That realization is devastating. Not because it proves they own you. It doesn't. But because it reveals the depth of what they once failed to recognize. They begin wondering. How many times did they have that choice? How many times could they have walked away? How many times did they choose restraint? How many times did I assume they didn't care? And the answers begin arriving. More than once. Much more than once. There were evenings when you nearly reached out. There were mornings when you almost changed your mind. There were days when you thought, maybe I should finally let this go. And then something inside you would whisper, not yet. Not because you were promised a reunion. Not because you knew the future. But because you knew one thing. You didn't want to leave the story with bitterness. You wanted to know that if you ever walked away permanently, you would do it with peace. That was your sacrifice. You weren't trying to force destiny. You were trying to leave without hatred. And that distinction matters. Because there is a difference between waiting for someone and leaving a door unlocked in your heart. You weren't standing at the door every day. You were living. You were growing. You were changing. But you never wanted to turn love into hatred just because it didn't work. You wanted to remember them without needing to punish them. And that is something your soulmate is struggling to understand now. Because they may have expected anger. They may have expected revenge. They may have expected you to tell everyone what happened. But instead, you became quiet. You protected the memories. You protected their name. You protected your own dignity. And you moved forward. That is what makes your story different. You didn't need to destroy them to prove they hurt you. You didn't need an audience to validate your pain. You didn't need everyone to know your side. You knew. And somehow, that became enough. But there is another layer. Because while you were sacrificing silently, your soulmate was also fighting something. Fear. Not necessarily fear of you. Fear of what loving you would require. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being exposed. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of losing control. Fear of becoming dependent on someone. Fear of admitting that you mattered more than they wanted you to matter. And sometimes people run from what they want because they are terrified of what wanting it means. They convince themselves they don't care. They create distance. They become unpredictable. They send mixed signals. They act stronger than they feel. They hide behind pride. And eventually, the person on the other side gets exhausted. That person was you. You weren't exhausted because you stopped loving. You were exhausted because you were constantly trying to understand what the other person wasn't saying. And now your soulmate is realizing that. They are looking backward and seeing moments where they could have made things easier. A simple conversation. A simple apology. A simple admission. I miss you. I was scared. I didn't know how to handle this. I care more than I showed. 4 or 5 words could have changed entire chapters. But they weren't spoken. And because they weren't spoken, you made choices based on silence. That's one of the cruelest things about relationships. People don't only make decisions based on what you say. They make decisions based on what you refuse to say. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that their silence had consequences. And those consequences were not immediate. They unfolded slowly. You started trusting less. You started expecting less. You started asking fewer questions. You stopped checking for signs. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped waiting for clarity. And eventually, you stopped being emotionally available in the same way. That was the sacrifice your soulmate didn't see. You didn't simply give up a person. You gave up a version of yourself. The version that believed love should always be fought for. The version that believed patience could solve everything. The version that believed if you explained your heart clearly enough, the other person would finally understand. You had to bury that version. And burying an old version of yourself can feel like grief. Nobody sends flowers for it. Nobody comes to the funeral. There is no ceremony. One day you simply realize, I cannot keep living this way. And then you change. Quietly. Permanently. Your soulmate may be experiencing that realization from the opposite side now. They are discovering that while they were deciding what they wanted, you were deciding what you could survive. And those are very different decisions. One is about desire. The other is about boundaries. You wanted them. But you needed peace. You missed them. But you needed stability. You loved them. But you needed to recognize yourself again. And when those things came into conflict, you chose yourself. Not because they meant nothing. Because you finally realized that you meant something too. That is the part they may have never understood. They knew you loved them. But they didn't realize you were capable of walking away while still loving them. Now they do. And it changes the entire balance of the story. Because once someone realizes that your love was never desperation, they start seeing it differently. You didn't stay because you couldn't find anyone else. You stayed because your heart was sincere. You didn't wait because you had no options. You waited because you were trying to give something meaningful a chance. And when you finally stepped away, it wasn't because you found something better. It was because you realized you deserved something healthier. That distinction is enormous. And now your soulmate is asking themselves a question that may hurt more than anything. Did they ever know how much I cared? Maybe they didn't. Maybe your soulmate believed you were stronger than you were. Maybe they assumed you didn't need reassurance. Maybe they thought your silence meant you were okay. Maybe they believed that because you didn't complain, you weren't suffering. But silence doesn't mean absence of pain. Sometimes silence is pain that has become too tired to speak. You learned that. And now they are learning it too. There is a moment in this story when your soulmate finds something. It could be an old message. A note. A photograph. A conversation. A memory. Something small. Something ordinary. But it contains a detail they completely missed the first time. Maybe you had written something like, I just want them to be happy. At the time, they may have read it casually. Now they read it differently. Because they know what happened afterward. They know you were hurt. They know you could have exposed them. They know you had every reason to become bitter. And yet, you still wish them happiness. That sentence suddenly becomes heavier. They put the phone down. They stare at the ceiling. And for a moment, they don't know what to do with the emotion rising inside them. Because gratitude and regret can exist at the same time. Love and guilt can exist at the same time. Missing someone and knowing you weren't ready for them can exist at the same time. Human hearts are complicated. And this fictional story isn't pretending otherwise. Your soulmate isn't suddenly perfect. They are not transformed by one revelation. They are simply becoming aware. And awareness is often the first painful step toward change. They start remembering the moments they could have chosen differently. They remember when you asked for clarity. They remember when you needed support. They remember when you gave them another chance. They remember when you forgave something that should have required a longer conversation. They remember when you stayed calm while they were distant. And then another memory appears. The day you finally stopped asking. That day seemed ordinary. But now it feels enormous. Because they realize something. You didn't announce that you were done. You simply became done. There was no dramatic ending. No final speech. No door slammed. Just a quiet shift. One day you stopped reaching. And they didn't notice immediately. That is what hurts. They thought there would always be another chance. Another message. Another conversation. Another opportunity to fix things. They assumed time was unlimited. But time doesn't make promises. And neither do hearts. There comes a point when a person can love you and still stop waiting for you. You reached that point. And now your soulmate is realizing it. They wonder whether you still think about them. Whether you still remember. Whether you still care. Whether your heart would recognize theirs if you met again. But they also understand something else. Even if you still care. You are not the same person. And they are not the same person either. That creates the central tension of this story. What happens when two people who once loved each other meet again after becoming different people? Do they repeat the old pattern? Or do they finally understand what the old version of themselves couldn't? That question remains unanswered. But the story is moving toward it. Because something has changed. Your soulmate isn't merely remembering you anymore. They are comparing. They compare the way you treated them with the way others have treated them. They compare your patience with other people's impatience. Your loyalty with other people's convenience. Your silence with other people's gossip. Your restraint with other people's selfishness. And slowly, they begin realizing what they had. Sometimes people don't recognize a rare thing while holding it. They only understand its value after encountering what is common. Maybe they met people who were available but not genuine. Maybe they met people who said beautiful things but disappeared when life became difficult. Maybe they experienced attention without emotional safety. Maybe they experienced attraction without understanding. And then they remembered you. Not because you were perfect. Because something about your presence felt different. You had seen them. Really seen them. Even the parts they tried to hide. And perhaps that frightened them. Because being truly seen means being vulnerable. You cannot hide behind an image when someone knows your contradictions. They knew your weaknesses. You knew theirs. And that kind of connection can feel terrifying. So perhaps your soulmate ran. Perhaps they created distance because closeness required honesty. And honesty required courage. You had courage. They didn't have enough at the time. Now, They are beginning to develop it. But courage that arrives late still has consequences. They know that. And that's why they hesitate. Because they are no longer asking, do I want them? They are asking, do I deserve another chance? That is a completely different question. And they don't know the answer. Maybe they remember the sacrifices you made. Maybe they remember the future you turned down. Maybe they finally understand that you didn't owe them any of it. You chose it freely. And that makes it more powerful. You were not obligated. You weren't married to a promise. You weren't required to wait. You weren't required to protect their reputation. You weren't required to forgive. You weren't required to remain emotionally loyal to someone who had not given you certainty. Yet you did many of those things anyway. Not because you were weak. Because your heart was sincere. And now sincerity is confronting them. This is where regret enters the story. Not the dramatic regret of someone who simply wants what they cannot have. Something deeper. The regret of realizing, I had something genuine, and I didn't know how to hold it. That kind of regret doesn't disappear quickly. It follows you into ordinary moments. A song plays. You remember. You walk past a familiar place. You remember. Someone says a phrase they used to say. You remember. You see a couple communicating openly. You remember what you failed to communicate. You receive a message from someone else. You remember the message you never sent. And suddenly, the past isn't really the past. It's a teacher. Your soulmate is learning from it. But there is still one thing they haven't learned. They don't know what happened immediately after you turned down that easier future. They don't know what you did that night. They don't know where you went. They don't know what you wrote. They don't know who you almost called. They don't know what promise you made to yourself. And this is the part that carries the deepest emotional weight. Because after choosing not to enter that new future, you didn't immediately feel peaceful. You broke down. Quietly. Alone. You allowed yourself to feel everything you had been holding. You cried over what was. You cried over what might never be. You cried over the possibility that perhaps your soulmate would never understand. And then you said something. Not to them. Not to anyone else. To yourself. A sentence that became a private vow. You said, if they ever come back, they will have to meet the person I became while they were gone. That sentence changed everything. Because you weren't promising to wait. You weren't promising to forgive. You weren't promising that the door would remain open. You were promising yourself that you would grow. You would heal. You would become stronger. You would stop abandoning yourself. And if they ever returned, they wouldn't be returning to the old version of you. They would have to meet the new one. That is the person your soulmate is beginning to sense now. And perhaps that's why they feel nervous. Because the old version of you might have accepted almost anything just to keep the connection alive. The new version won't. The old version might have said, I understand. The new version might say, explain. The old version might have forgiven without accountability. The new version requires change. The old version might have waited indefinitely. The new version understands that time is valuable. The old version might have believed love could solve everything. The new version understands that love without communication can become loneliness. And this is the transformation your sacrifice created. You didn't sacrifice yourself forever. You sacrificed an old identity. And you became someone who knows what their heart deserves. Your soulmate is shocked because they expected to find the person they left behind. Instead, they are discovering someone they may no longer know how to approach. Someone softer in some ways. Stronger in others. Someone who still has compassion, but no longer confuses compassion with self-abandonment. Someone who can forgive, without forgetting the lesson. Someone who can love, without begging. Someone who can miss, without chasing. Someone who can remember, without returning to the same pain. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If your soulmate came back today, would they recognize you? Would they know how to speak to you? Would they understand the boundaries you now have? Would they be willing to do the work they avoided before? Because your sacrifice changed the standard. You no longer need words. You need evidence. You no longer need promises. You need consistency. You no longer need someone to tell you they care. You need someone whose behavior makes the statement unnecessary. And somewhere inside this fictional story, your soulmate is realizing that. They are realizing that the version of you they once had access to was a gift, not a guarantee. And perhaps they are finally understanding the cost of losing that gift. But then something happens. Something they didn't expect. They receive another piece of information. Someone tells them about the opportunity you turned down. They learn that it wasn't simply another person. It was a serious possibility. A different life. A future that could have been stable. A future that could have been peaceful. And suddenly, they understand. You weren't sitting around waiting helplessly. You were making choices. You had options. You simply chose not to make a promise your heart couldn't honor. That revelation hits harder than anything else. Because now they cannot tell themselves. They stayed because they had no choice. No. You had a choice. And you chose integrity. That is what shocks them. You could have chosen comfort. You could have chosen attention. You could have chosen revenge. You could have chosen someone else just to make your soulmate jealous. But you didn't. You chose honesty with yourself. And now your soulmate is forced to confront their own choices. What did they choose? Pride? Fear? Distance? Silence? And what did those choices cost? Maybe they lost moments. Maybe they lost trust. Maybe they lost a version of you that will never return. And maybe they lost the chance to love you when loving you would have been easier. Because now, if they ever approach you again, they won't be meeting the same person. They will be meeting someone who learned how expensive emotional confusion can be. Someone who knows that love must have a foundation. Someone who understands that timing matters. Someone who no longer wants to be someone's almost. And that thought is frightening to them. Because they realize you may not be waiting. And perhaps you aren't. Maybe you're simply living. Maybe you're building. Maybe you're becoming peaceful. Maybe you're discovering that your future is much larger than one connection. Maybe you still love them. Maybe you don't. Maybe the answer changes depending on the day. And that's okay. Healing isn't always a straight line. Sometimes you miss someone after believing you were completely over them. Sometimes a memory returns after months of silence. Sometimes you dream about someone you thought you had released. That doesn't mean you're supposed to go backward. It means you are human. And this story wants you to remember that. Your soulmate's realization does not become your responsibility. Their regret is not your burden. Their confusion is not your assignment. Their healing is not your job. You can care without carrying them. You can forgive without returning. You can love without surrendering your peace. And if they ever come back, let their actions speak. Let time reveal whether their realization was temporary emotion or genuine transformation. Because the greatest proof of change is not a dramatic confession. It is consistency. It is accountability. It is patience. It is respect. It is the ability to communicate when things become uncomfortable. It is choosing honesty when lying would be easier. It is staying present when fear says run. That is what your soulmate would need to learn. And perhaps they are finally ready to learn it. But there is still a secret. The person who told them about your sacrifice didn't tell them everything. They left out one detail. One detail that changes the entire story. Because the opportunity you turned down wasn't the only opportunity you sacrificed. There was another one. Much bigger. And this second sacrifice involved a decision that could have completely changed the direction of your life. You didn't tell your soulmate because you didn't want them to feel guilty. You didn't tell them because you didn't want your love to become a debt. You never wanted them to think, they sacrificed this for me, so now I owe them. That was never what you wanted. You wanted to choose freely. And you did. But now the truth is beginning to surface anyway. The person who knows this second secret has finally decided to speak. And when they do, your soulmate will hear something they never expected. They will learn that there was a moment when you could have walked away forever. Not temporarily. Not emotionally. Completely. You could have erased the connection. You could have closed every door. You could have chosen a future where their name never appeared in your plans again. And you came dangerously close. But then, you saw something. Something that reminded you why you had loved them in the first place. And instead of choosing revenge, you made one final sacrifice. You gave them time. Not unlimited time. Not your entire life. Just enough time for them to become the person they were capable of becoming. You didn't know whether they would. You didn't know whether they ever would. But you chose not to close the door with hatred. That was your final act of love. And your soulmate is only now discovering it. But there is one problem. The time you gave them may already be running out. Because while they are finally understanding your sacrifice, you have already begun building a life that doesn't depend on their return. And that is where the next chapter becomes impossible to predict. Because they may finally be ready to speak. At the exact moment you finally become ready to let go. And somewhere between those two moments lies the truth neither of you has faced yet. The truth about whether this connection was meant to be restored. Or simply meant to transform you both. Your soulmate is standing on one side of that question. You are standing on the other. And neither of you knows what happens when the distance finally disappears. But they are closer to the answer than they realize. Because the next thing they discover isn't about what you sacrificed. It's about what you secretly wished they would do after learning the truth. And that wish was never what they imagined. You didn't wish for them to beg. You didn't wish for them to suffer. You didn't wish for revenge. You didn't even wish for a grand apology. You wished for something much simpler. You wished that, someday, they would finally understand. And now, they do. But understanding is only the beginning. Because once they understand what you sacrificed, they must decide what they are willing to sacrifice themselves. And that is where the story is about to become even more intense. Because for the first time, the question isn't, what did you give up for them? The question is, what are they willing to give up for the truth they just discovered? And they are about to find out that loving you again, if they choose to try, would require them to surrender the very thing that once kept them away from you. Their pride. Their fear. Their silence. Their excuses. Their old patterns. And most importantly, their belief that you would always be there. Because you won't be the same person waiting at the door anymore. You will be standing somewhere else. Living. Growing. Choosing. And if they want to reach you, they will have to walk toward you this time. Not halfway. Not when convenient. Not when lonely. Not when nostalgia becomes unbearable. They will have to come with truth. And perhaps that is exactly what they are preparing to do. But before they take that step, one final piece of the past is going to surface. A piece you thought would remain hidden forever. A private sacrifice. A decision made on a night when you were completely alone. And when your soulmate learns what happened that night, they will finally understand why you never told them how deeply you were hurt. Because the answer isn't simply that you loved them. The answer is much deeper. You were trying to protect something. Not them. Not the relationship. Not even the future. You were trying to protect the last beautiful version of love you still carried inside yourself. And what happened that night changed the way you would love forever. That secret is still waiting. And when it finally comes to light, your soulmate won't just be shocked. They will finally understand why your silence was never emptiness. It was the final language your heart knew how to speak.